I don't know about everybody else, but I certainly am completely blown away by the way in which the technology operates to get the infrastructure in place and how we are moving. You know, seeing a whole field of the wind propellers gathering the energy is to me quite a remarkable sight. Marianne is going to kick off and generally talk about the offshore wind projects, and in particular the challenges that those projects give rise to, and clearly where she is based in one of the major suppliers to the infrastructure. She's particularly well placed to tell us about those challenges.
Thank you, Sian. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. I feel like I'm sitting on the other side of the fence now. I was in private practice until quite recently, and I'm now have a GC role at Seaway 7, which is very exciting. So you'll have seen a little bit about what we do from the film. I'm sorry for the PR. It's not really meant to be PR. It was more to give a sense of the scale and the complexity of the projects that are happening offshore in the offshore wind sector. And I know we're going to talk about other renewable parts of the industry as well, but obviously I'm very much embedded in offshore wind now. Just to give you a sense of where we operate, because it's relevant when you're thinking about jurisdiction and disputes and how they are managed. We operate in the North Sea, in the Baltic, in the Americas, so off the east coast of the States, and in Taiwan and Korea, and increasingly in Australia. So those are where you find offshore wind farms, so that's where we operate. We thought it might be helpful just to give a sense of where we see disputes coming from in our space. And they come from all the areas that you would expect as construction lawyers. So, you know, program slipping, interface issues, poor change management, all that kind of stuff. So we have all of that. But layered on top of that, we have a specific challenges from the environments that we operate in. So first of all, pretty obvious thing to say, and it applied, I guess, to the oil and gas guys who were talking in the previous panel, but we operate in some incredibly hostile environments. Wind, wave, weather, etc., trying to cope with those. I know the oil and gas guys cope with those as well, but we are slightly different in that where they are potentially constructing one very large thing in the middle of the North Sea or wherever, we are constructing 100, 120 very large things, one after the other. So our monopiles, you know, they go in, there's 120 of them, 150 of them, however many. So all the issues that you're having with weather, all the issues especially that you're having with ground risk, you have over and over and over and over again. You know, and then if you get it wrong, if you have a defect, I say a defect in the sense of one thing that's technically gone wrong in your design or the way you've gone about installing the item, then you end up having a serial defect. So it happens over and over and over again. So those are the kind of issues that we have to think about, and you know, I'm hoping for some brilliant ideas from the panel and you guys about how best we go about solving those disputes, as well as those kind of environment issues, if I can put them like that. We have a whole heap of technical issues. Now, we're quite a new business, a new industry. We've not been around for that long. So there's a huge amount of technical progress has happened. When we first started putting turbines in, they were about 2 to 3 megawatt per turbine. They were quite wee. These things are now absolutely massive. They're 15 megawatts. You know, the size, people often say it's the height of the gherkin if you look at the offshore wind farm, looking up at it, and that gives you a sense of how massive these things are. So of course, we're not in steady state. Everything has to keep being redesigned and redeveloped to cope with that technological development. So the wind turbines get bigger, so the foundations and the transition pieces they have to go on get bigger. You know, the vessels that are needed to carry them get bigger. So we're constantly in a state of flux, and as you will know as disputes lawyers, that creates disputes in itself. The other fun thing that we have to deal with is the way that our projects are funded. So unlike in the oil and gas sector, where quite often you have nice big international energy companies or international oil companies who have quite big balance sheets, The vast majority of our projects are debt financed. So we have lenders involved, and we have, so as a contractor, our client will be an SPV. So the impact of that, well, one of the main impacts we feel in the supply chain is that there is a huge pressure of risk out of the banks and down the supply chain. And that in itself causes disputes because our margins get very pushed. So anything that goes wrong on the project, any element of change, potentially leads into a big falling out and something that needs to be resolved. I'm sure I've forgotten lots of other important things that come up.
Not at all.
One point I did want to end on is contracts, bringing it back, because I know we're a room full of lawyers. Brandon was talking about logic in the previous session. Most of the contracts that we deal with are FIDIC based. FIDIC, obviously very well-known contract in the onshore infrastructure space. What it isn't is a contract geared towards offshore. So even before you start using that contract, it has to have some significant changes done to it just to accommodate the fact that we're dealing with vessels. FIDIC doesn't say anything about vessels. Doesn't say a lot terribly helpful about weather. It doesn't say anything about marine warranty surveyors. It doesn't have a knock-for-knock indemnity regime, which if you're coming from the oil and gas offshore wind, offshore space, oil and gas offshore space, you would expect to see. So you're already having lots of changes put in there. And then, with my contractor's chip on my shoulder, I will say that banks, the way that the projects are financed means a lot of risk starts getting pushed down through the FIDIC contracts onto contractors. So we're finding, for example, that FIDIC Yellow Book is often the standard form contract that the bespoke contracts will be based on, but we find Yellow Book is used even in circumstances where it's a transport and installation contract, not an EPCI. So we don't actually have any design, and yet we're using a Yellow Book form, which is based on the assumption that the contractor is carrying out design. So lots of seeds sown there for things that can go wrong.
Well, certainly, just drawing on that contractual point, I mean, obviously, the contract is where it all begins and ends. The fact that it's a relatively immature market still and requires bespoke amendments, have you and anyone else in the panel come across this problem where you are effectively dealing with a template contract which has then been amended and adjusted in a way that causes the very mechanism for using the template to fall down because you've got the wrong interactions between the different clauses? Has anybody come across that in projects? Samantha?
Yeah, I have come across that. It's on a dispute that has not yet been resolved, so I can't say too much about it, but it is that classic example of taking a standard FIDIC form contract, adapting it for the wind industry, and in particular adapting an EOT mechanism and LD's mechanism in a way that just do not gel together. So in that particular case, we were looking at unamended or almost unamended FIDIC terms with a little annex that said, oh, by the way, here's everything we've kind of agreed on EOTs and LDs, but we're not going to say anything about how these two systems are supposed to interact. So even before the contractor and the owner start arguing over whether there is an extension of time or how LDs are going to be dealt with or putting in claims, there's a dispute over how you actually interpret the contract. So yeah, I've already come across that problem.
Yeah.
Is there any reason, I mean, I'm putting this out generally, is there any reason why, I know it's a new sector, I get that, but it's not that new. Is there any reason why the people who make money from preparing template contracts have not worked out that they need to do a new book of contracts?
Well, that is happening. So,
yeah.
FIDIC are looking at doing an offshore wind specific contract. There may be some people on the drafting committee in the room. I don't know that. So, but that will be 2025 earliest before we see that. IMCA, so the International Marine Contractors Association, have put out Renewables principles. So they are already there, and they also have a transport and installation contract that they've put out. But obviously contracts are drafted by the developer's employer's side, and they tend to come from the utilities, and they tend to be much more comfortable with FIDIC. So I think
it's going to be a process of evolution.
Logic, BIMCO, they're all looking at offshore wind contracts. It's definitely, to your question, yes, you're right, and others have thought of that, but it's going to be a process, I think, to get people to start to use those new contracts.
Sorry, just on that point then, Sian, I do actually think, given renewables, in a form, it's been around for ages, eons in a form in terms of renewable projects. It is actually surprising that we haven't seen the development of more specific sector rather than just NEC, rather than just FIDIC. We're not seeing that an awful lot, and it does seem to be a glaring omission, and it would certainly avoid some of these disputes that we're starting to have because of the fact we do have to amend them so heavily.
It seems curious to me because quite a lot of industries don't wait for contract makers like FIDIC to put it together. They've got their own in-house ones, and because they are major players in the industry, that almost becomes the norm. It's quite a small world, although obviously you're all international doing this work. It strikes me as a field where that could be the approach taken. And I'm sure you have all come across bespoke amendments which are held by that client and applied routinely. And those work for that client, but nobody's taken the jump to creating the template contract. Maybe we'll have an ADR Renewables UKA conference contract book following this event. Just moving on now, can we change the slide, please, to the...
I'll just go up and do it.
No, it's up. It's up.
Oh. Magic.
So this is what I have christened the slide of slides, which in a very nice graphic form, thank you very much Victoria Tyson and her production team for providing it. It sets the scene for what could be described as the common challenges in renewable energy construction projects. So broadening out now, not just wind, but also solar and hydroelectric. And I assume there's no other source.
Well, I think there is.
Which one have I forgotten? Wind, solar?
Hydropower, solar, onshore and offshore wind, green hydrogen, tidal energy.
Hydrogen, yes.
There's many.
Yes, green hydrogen is the one I perpetually forget, sorry.
Yeah.
Could we lead off, Victoria, with some of what you would describe as the common challenges?
Yes, I think before we fix the problem, we need to identify what the problem is. And these are some of the challenges that I just brainstormed and put down. I'm sure you've got more that you can add and talk about yourselves. I'm going to focus on the cross-border and political challenges, and a case that I've been involved in for quite a long time. And that's the cross-border tension in northeast Africa, where Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan have been at odds over the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which we call GERD, which is on the Blue Nile, and 85% of the Nile's water flows from this point. Okay. It's initiated in April 2011, and it's going to be Africa's largest dam. I was involved both in the tripartite agreement between the three nations at the start and also during various construction disputes that have arisen during the construction project. The reservoir for the dam itself is the surface area of Greater London, so it's enormous, absolutely enormous. So it's hoped that this will double Ethiopia's electricity output, which is great for Ethiopia. But Egypt and Sudan are a little bit upset about it, and this is where the tensions are. And you might have seen them and heard about them in the news, but I just thought I'd set the scene here today. So Egypt has a population of 107 million people and relies on the River Nile for all of its water. The Nile water is also used for the reservoir for Egypt's largest dam, the Aswan High Dam, for its own electricity supply. Sudan, with a population of 48 million people, is heavily reliant on water for the Nile. And Egypt also argues that a 2% reduction in water from the Nile could result in a loss of 200,000 acres of irrigated land. Egypt's concerned that in times of drought, Ethiopia might fill the dam to generate electricity instead of letting the water flow downstream. And Sudan is also concerned, but due to internal conflicts within Sudan at the moment, which you've probably heard of, its response has been somewhat restricted. Okay. So this problem has been discussed many times. In 2019, the International Crisis Group, an organisation which works to prevent wars, warned that armed conflict was possible. The US intervened in 2019 and reached an agreement between Egypt and Ethiopia, but tried to reach an agreement, but with little success. My favourite bit, the 24th of October 2020, President Donald Trump tries to help. And in a telephone call to the Sudan's Prime Minister and Israel's Prime Minister, and I wish I could do an American accent, but I can't, he said, "It's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And I said it, and I say it loud and clear. They'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something." So Joe Biden gets involved in 2022, and he reasserts the American support and says that Egypt's water security, that he's going to support Egypt's water security and looks forward to forging a diplomatic resolution to the issue. Anyway, in recent years now, due to the threat of a possible airstrike, I wonder where that's come from, thank you, Mr. Trump, the Ethiopian government has sought and bought several air defence systems from Russia and from Israel. So, I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Egypt tried to block the sale between Israel and Ethiopia, but Egypt has ignored the request. So there you go. There's my example of political pressure and cross-border tensions.
Yes.
I'm sure others may have some examples themselves.
Quite a spin-off from what you might normally expect in terms of a discussion about construction contracts.
I bet it's all construction contracts.
Yes, no, exactly. And you know, the added idea that you might also need weapons to protect yourself and your contractual position.
But that's a fair point, because I think security is a big issue, which I didn't put on there. I'm thinking, Marianne, with the cables. Yeah.
I don't know if that's where you're going in your mind, but I was just thinking about Taiwan. I mean, in terms of political pressure, there's a obvious constant risk from China and the way they manage their projects and the way they manage their vessels and the vessels that they can use, because they can't use vessels that are made in China in Taiwan. So there's that piece. It's quite a different example from the one that you've come up with, Victoria. But
were you highlighting a particular security risk to the cables that you're mentioning?
No, because this is the dam.
I was just thinking generally, because obviously you're running these across seabed areas.
But I think generally, you know, with any electricity, you know, it's the fastest way to knock out a country in time of conflict. So there are security issues to consider.
Yes. Maybe we should rename this session, you know, ADR war disputes.
Slightly, not quite political security, but we've advised on a project in the same jurisdiction, and as you say, they can become really focal political projects, and there have been a lot of issues with rebels in that country targeting the transmission lines, that sort of thing, because they a bit more active NIMBYism.
Yes, quite. Well, I mean, they're massive infrastructure projects. They're also very visible, and they're also, how can I put it, they're sexy. In terms of infrastructure, the renewables is where it's at, unless you happen to be doing semiconductor production, and AI. Renewables is it. Shall we move back slightly to what we're meant to be talking about, which is dispute resolution in these areas? Now, Ed, I know I was going to ask you a question about what seems to be the preferred form of dispute resolution for these sectors generally?
Yeah. Sorry, it's a lot drier than what we've just been discussing, but arbitration is obviously the preferred form of dispute resolution for renewable projects, and I just wanted to sort of draw out why, looking at the points that have helpfully been set out on the slide of slides. Typically, that's what we see, arbitration as the final method of dispute resolution. DAB usually crossed out, I think, apart from hydroelectric projects, in my experience, and provisions for parties to hold representatives' talks. But apart from that, no provisions for mediation. It's arbitration or negotiation. And there are obvious benefits with international projects for choosing arbitration that we all know. I think the most important for renewables projects is if you're working as an international contractor overseas, you need a reliable and neutral judiciary. You need decision makers that have got the expertise to decide the issues which are likely to arise, which are likely to revolve around failings in new technology, so be quite complicated. And also, of course, you've got the usual construction issues of delay and quantum, so you need judiciary with that expertise. But also, I think a really key factor is confidentiality, and that ties in with the high construction costs and financing points on these slides, because once a project is built, it's going to be a lot cheaper to run than your average project. The operation and maintenance costs are going to be relatively low because the wind and the sun are free. So it's at this construction stage that things can go really terribly wrong. The costs are high and the risks are high in a nascent industry. So I think confidentiality is absolutely key. Particularly if you've got state parties or associated with state parties, they're going to want everything to be confidential, as are listed companies. So that's why.
And you touched on then about the judiciary and the arbitrators, the tribunals that are sitting on these. What typically are their expertises that you're finding most commonly arising?
Well, it's very common, obviously, to see members of the English bar, people who've been practicing construction law. Sometimes we see people who non-solicitor or barrister, people that tends to be lawyers with expertise in these areas.
For those ones who are not lawyers, what field do they tend to come from? Is it the engineering field, or is it?
I think it depends very much on the nature of the project. So on a hydropower project, you might get tunnelling experts, geotechnical experts that are also sitting as dispute board members in particular.
Yes, yeah. So you can call on those. Now, I was interested that you two had an exchange there. I don't know if everybody saw it, but DABs have been crossed out except in hydroelectric.
I see them
in hydroelectric. So
I do, yeah.
Why have they remained there? Is it because you need that extra additional expertise?
I don't know, but they work very well, particularly the standing board. Dispute boards work really well on hydropower projects, which are huge projects with large interfaces, lots of interfaces between different works packages if they're not a single EPC contract. So I think they work, so they're used.
I can't remember historically, but is hydroelectric a slightly older sibling to the others? And so they've worked out it works?
I don't know.
Don't know. Just wondering. Because dams have been around for a very long time.
I mean, they are long construction periods, aren't they? So you do need an interim decision. Yeah. If arbitration is all you've got, you're going to be waiting till the end of the project for a decision. So.
I just wanted to ask Ed, I think you said you don't see mediation, which surprised me because I do. So,
I do too.
Yeah. That's my experience. Yeah.
I think just to pick up on that, I think it depends sometimes on where in the project chain you're looking at DR clauses. So certainly on the types of mandates that Freshfields gets involved in, they're normally kind of high value, first of a kind projects, a little bit of a mix between owner and contractor, but not sort of at the subcontractor level. And certainly at that owner and main contractor level, we still see mediation being used, but I often see it as optional. So rather than having it as a mandatory step in the DR process, in more recent times I've seen it as an option for the party who wants to raise a dispute. And at least in my own experience, I think that tends to work. The reason why I'm personally against it, if it's a mandatory step, is because I've seen, particularly in the oil and gas industry previously, multi-billion-dollar contracts for multi-billion-dollar disputes that have a compulsory mediation step. And I've been involved in some of those, one in particular, where we spent 6 months preparing for this all singing, all dancing mediation. We had parties flying in from all over the world, and within 2 hours of what was supposed to be a 5-day mediation, it became very, very clear that nothing was ever going to settle, and that we'd basically wasted 6 months when we could have just issued a request for arbitration and been on our merry formal DR way.
Yes.
So I think you do see them, but I think depending on where in the project chain you're looking, and depending on the scale of the project and its value, people, I think, decide whether they're going to have an option to skip that step or whether they're very insistent on it.
Sorry.
I mean, often, obviously, these sorts of disputes can turn on technical issues. So each party is going to turn up with their own expert to the mediation, and the amounts in dispute can be so large that my experience of mediation, when it's been agreed, having not been in the contract, is it's not been successful until later down the line. Maybe you've got a decision on a particular liability, then quantum can be mediated.
I think that was an interesting point, actually, that was raised earlier by some of the other panels in terms of the expectation, certainly in the UK proceedings and the pre-action protocol, the expectation for the meeting in many instances, it's just too early. We haven't had an opportunity to see the proper whites of the other party's eyes. You haven't seen their documents. You haven't had a proper understanding of what the risk is in terms of these disputes. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of for mediation to be successful, particularly in the renewables sector, you've got to be selecting when you're going to that mediation very carefully.
That's interesting, because on the FIDIC tiered system, they have the dispute board, and then they have the amicable settlement period, which is sometimes where you see the mediation coming in after they've seen the whites of the other side's eyes, but then before you go to arbitration.
There was, sorry, go on.
No, I was a slightly different perspective on it, actually, because we have had a number of experiences where we have had compulsory mediation. And exactly as you say, I was sort of thinking, I'm not sure this is a great idea. But actually, from a business point of view, we quite liked it because it required both sides to really focus on settlement. And obviously, you've got the escalation process, etc. Anyway, but to have that slightly more formal circumstance actually was quite helpful to say, look, we have to go through this before we kind of press the nuclear button, as as the business would think of it. But just on the top of that, I just wanted to comment that, and people may have experience of the DIS, the German arbitration scheme, whereby they seem to have this settlement facilitation phase. I don't know if any of you guys have got experience of that, but I thought that was quite interesting, where the arbitrators will lead you towards a settlement facilitation meeting before you go to the next stage in the process, and to actually have that kind of the arbitrators actually almost acting as mediators. I mean, it may or may not work, but I thought, again, from a business point of view of really trying to compel the parties to talk to each other, I thought that was quite interesting.
There's a bit more of a push, I think. The ICC recent guidance notes talks about trying to allow windows in the timetable for mediation, trying to encourage it, but there are no cost consequences or anything, are there, failing to mediate? So
there's lots of different styles of mediation as well, aren't there? I mean, it can be very relaxed, or it can be almost akin to another arbitration.
I think it's interesting, the idea that, particularly from the company perspective that you're looking at, Marianne, is if you have a compulsory mediation, nobody's blinking when they suggest mediation. They're just rolling through the next stage of the contract. And I would imagine that's quite a useful thing to have, where you do have two parties who, literally can look at an orange and describe it differently. That strikes me as a useful setup. Now, I know, Samantha, you've mentioned about whether the multi-tiered DR really works, and the issue being whether it's, for each stage, whether it's actually final and binding.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can
It's
talk us through.
It's another one of my pet peeves. So that also comes from experience dealing with multiple cases. One involved a mediation that had been successful, and there was a very pretty settlement agreement, and everybody signed it. And then one party decided that they didn't like the settlement agreement, so there was going to be an arbitration anyway, and the settlement agreement ended up in the air. And I think now 3 years later, there is finally a merits hearing on the matter later this year. So that was one in terms of mediation. We did not draft the settlement agreement, I will add. But the other is on expert determination. So I had 2 cases not that long ago where they were completely unrelated, and they both had very similar clauses in relation to the final and binding nature of expert determination, but with a couple of words different. I think one was final and binding unless, and the other was not final and binding until, something along those lines. But they all turned on whether there was manifest error in the expert determination, so on the face of the actual decision that the expert had rendered. Lo and behold, I ended up on both of these matters for completely separate clients, actually completely separate countries, but they ended up before the same arbitrator, one after another. So in one matter, the person acted as a sole arbitrator, and in another, he was on a tribunal. So we ended up having an arbitration which lasted about a year solely on the issue of whether the expert determination was final and binding, and both related to very technical points. In one case, the decision was not final and binding, and we ended up in another full-blown arbitration, and again had wasted our life doing this expert determination, which in and of itself took a year. And in the other case, it was final and binding, and we were over and done with within about 6 months, which was great. So going back to the question as to whether multi-tiered DR clauses really work, I actually think they can, and I think they do in a lot of circumstances, but it requires really careful drafting and really careful thinking through the utility of each stage in the DR process, what the actual outcome is going to be, and whether that outcome is final and binding, and if it's not, how do you then move to the next tier? Otherwise, I think you can end up in a situation like I have done previously, where you're just arguing an argument that doesn't need to be argued. Because actually the crux of the matter is X million pounds over delay or over increased costs on a project, when really you're spending however many months and your client's spending however many thousands or millions in fees arguing over this one sentence that somebody drafted in their DR clause, 10 years ago. So I think they can work, but I think it's a plea to all drafters out there to really think about how those clauses are drafted to make it properly work.
Sian, can I just share a bit of a war story in terms of expert determination? And I know we've had some very clear proponents for it today. It wasn't quite a renewables case, it was a waste case. We had a consultant who'd been helping a local authority client, so it's a domestic case. They came to us because this expert determination, the process had been going on for 6 years. Not the dispute, the process. As you can imagine, we sort of fed in terms of it. By the time they ended up with that decision, final and binding, neither was happy with it, but they certainly weren't going to do anything further after 6 years of an expert determination. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly from what you've all said about the expert determination, it's like Marmite. It's very much down to the quality of that particular decision, that particular expert, those particular facts. So as an ADR method, it seems to be the biggest risk one, which of course is not great for either side pursuing a ADR in order to actually avoid going into a full-blown dispute. Somebody has mentioned, I'm just trying to think who it was, the specific mention about dispute boards, it was you, Victoria, about having the issue about having the engineer administering the contract and then also being the maker of decisions and determinations.
Marianne, you raised this, didn't you? You're not a big fan of the engineer in the FIDIC forms.
Yeah,
well,
I
the
have a slight bee in my bonnet
resolution,
about it.
yeah.
I'm not sure it's that I'm not a big fan, it's that my lot are not a big fan. So first of all, I talk about the engineer and they think, oh, that's lovely, we're all engineers, which most of them are.
Yeah.
And then I have to explain it's engineer with a capital E and someone who performs a particular function. And again, this is me with my contractor's chip on the shoulder, but our perception is the engineer with capital E has quite a difficult role to play, given that they are supposedly performing, they have in fact, even more of a split function, haven't they? Because sometimes they are performing as the employer's person, and sometimes they're performing as an independent third party, well, query over independent, but a neutral third party. And given that person is usually employed by the employer, that is a very difficult position for people to take. And our perception is that people often do not achieve the level of neutrality that is required in making their determinations. And given they are kind of the first step in resolving issues and disputes between the parties, you know, it feels like they are not helping in that process. You know, if they were to make decisions in a slightly more neutral way, I think it would help resolve disputes earlier. But you know, we get engineers' decisions which, you know, use language like the contractor is being utterly ridiculous in putting forward, which just the very fact that using that language indicates that they're not taking a neutral position.
Do you think they sometimes make problems worse? I mean, because
But
obviously the benefit is that
exactly.
you've got so many interface issues to deal with, and you should get a decision there and then that is going to stop problems.
And I think if we thought that was a fair, that the person was making a fair decision, even if it's against us, then probably we'd accept that and move on. But it's the fact that they're really, and it's a very difficult role for somebody to play, to kind of wear those two hats at the same time. But it is something we have. I do have a bee in my bonnet about. I was saying I didn't, but I do.
Because you've then got to comply with the decision.
Yeah, exactly. Or you're catapulted into the dispute resolution provisions.
Yeah. So FIDIC tried to address that by introducing in the supplement to the FIDIC Red Book 4th edition this concept of dispute boards. And that's why you have them. But you write out dispute boards.
Yeah, but don't blame me.
But, you know.
The industry tends to. Yeah.
Yes. I've already, I think we've addressed the question, which was what difficulties, if any, arise from the role of the engineer. I mean, obviously, it's a poison chalice to be a contract administrator and then supposedly the actual dispute resolver.
But it's interesting because in the 2017 editions, you now have to issue a notice of dissatisfaction to the engineer's determination as well as to
so they're literally marking their own homework.
It's making it even worse. Yeah.
Going back now more generally, and we've mostly spoken about a little bit hydroelectric, but mostly about wind. Ed, do you want to talk a bit about the key factors driving disputes in solar projects?
Sure. Well, solar projects are not going to have all the same interface risks that we saw in that lovely video earlier. They're obviously got the same key issues that are going to arise about delay, variations and quality issues, but far less interface, so should be much simpler to construct. Typically, you're going to have the photovoltaic works, which is what everyone sees, the huge panels that you may see by the M4, or you see big videos of huge projects in the Middle East and elsewhere. And then that's the panels, the trackers there on all the low and medium voltage cabling. Then there'll be a series of inverters and transformers, and they're all in little loops. So each of those little loops produces power much the same way that a solar panel on top of your house would, and it's brought together. then generated into high voltage, and then you have your high voltage works with the connection to the grid. So any dispute, in my experience, about delay is going to be, well, what was delayed? Was it the PV works or the high voltage works, and getting the connection to the grid? And for contractors internationally, well, I think everywhere, getting a connection to the grid's a real problem. But for contractors internationally that I've advised, they've had problems in the scope of works that they've been assuming through the interconnection works. Grids are just around the world needing updating, and there's this huge surge everywhere in power coming online. So I've had clients who've been asked to do works on grids that are hundreds of kilometres away from the project on the basis it's needed for the project to be installed. And you know, that really should be a clear variation, but it won't be issued. Yeah, so that's a common problem. And I think connected with that, there's also sort of political risks about, well, if you're working in a new market, what's their appetite for renewables, and what's their appetite for foreign investment? They can treat international contractors quite poorly in that regard, where you really need their cooperation. For the PV works, it really ought to be a question of assembling the equipment and putting it all together. Should be more straightforward than a wind project, for example, to maintain schedule, because the site is so much more accessible. But a couple of problems I've seen with the PV works is that, like Marianne was saying, with a wind farm, it's 120 different structures. For a solar farm, you know, it's a huge project with many different structures. So if you start having concerns about quality, then that's pervasive, and it calls into question. So it's going to be a lot harder to replace or repair or monitor than, for example, a turbine in a gas-powered station. Another issue on a more commercial level that we've seen is owners often have good relationships with suppliers, so they will impose a nominated supplier, and then that can create difficulties for the main contractors' sort of commercial relationship and leverage over suppliers. Yeah. So if they need monitoring or they need to agree LTSAs and other documents with suppliers, that can become quite difficult. Solar is now branching out a little bit to things like floating solar, which obviously going to create new challenges and maybe bring in some more interface risks and greater risks relating to ground conditions and design, such as, you know, going to have to design anchoring systems and so on. Of course, solar, like everything, has had supply issues as well. Yes. In recent years.
Is it because, I mean, perhaps this also applies to wind, or perhaps it doesn't, but if you have an issue affecting the progress of the project in one location, because you've literally got component-based construction as opposed to the usual a path along a critical path, and you can't jump ahead, does it mean that you can actually catch up on delays more easily? And is that expected in the industry? And so is that fed into the way in which negotiations and things like that happen?
I think there's the ability, if a contractor falls behind schedule, to accelerate works more easily.
Right.
But obviously there'll be a clear sequence that can't be overcome.
Within the particular unit that they're producing. I mean, I suppose there's no point in having all your units prepared if you haven't even started on the grid connection. You're going to have to run that in parallel.
Yeah, and you're going to need your inverters, transformers, and so on.
One thing, is that the same for a wind farm, or is that...
What the key issues around delay in wind farms are around the vessels, really.
Yes, I mean, it's a unique factor, isn't it, that there's a limited number of vessels in literally the world, so you can't actually delay, or there's a limited scope for delay.
Well, one of the things we negotiate the latest vessel availability date. So once you hit that, the vessel goes whether the client likes it or not, because we have to sell them. You know, we're selling vessels now for 2028, 2029.
Yeah.
I think
So.
perhaps the equivalent in UK solar, at least, which I must admit I haven't got experience of, but I think Jessica has, is getting permission to access the grid. Aren't there sort of key dates that you've got to meet?
Yeah.
So that's a sort of hard stop, isn't it?
It really is. It does really focus the mind. So you're right in terms of the acceleration, technical acceleration, certainly in terms of my experience. I'm sure there's many in the room who are much more technically minded than that. There's little flexibility there, despite the fact that this is really established technology. It is, as you say, it's resource flooding. That's the opportunity. But you've got to hit that date. Though, it's a discussion point for a different day. But I suspect many in the room have also had situations where connection dates have been agreed. They're far too in the future than we would like, but then suddenly you get a letter saying, actually, that connection date, which was 8 years in the future, it's actually now going to be 15 years in the future. So maybe it isn't such a hard stop nowadays.
Those things move on, yes. Yeah, what doesn't seem to be possible suddenly becomes possible.
I was going to talk about some of the legal issues
I was
as well.
about to ask you that. No, I was about to ask
okay.
you.
Yeah.
For solar, what are the contracts looking like? We've talked about what the contracts are like for wind and for hydro. That's predominantly FIDIC. What are the contracts looking like for solar?
Generally, some variations of FIDIC is
again,
what I've seen, but no bespoke, but sort of mirroring FIDIC.
Okay.
My experience.
And are the ADR provisions similar again? So
again, no DABs in my experience, but I have had experience of parties agreeing to do a DAB process, even though it's not in the contract. I think that's been the preference over going to a technical expert because of sort of broader ambit. But
I think just on that, picking up what you were saying, Ed, and also what you were saying, Marianne, because of the limited number of suppliers and players across different bits of the renewables industry, if you like, at least in my practice, I think from an ADR perspective, even if you have your all singing, all dancing multi-tiered DR clause and your beautifully drafted arbitration clause, my sense at least is that there is a real push across the industry for people to sit around a table, to get onto looking at claims early and to actually look towards coming up with a solution together as soon as possible. Because I think everyone kind of has a vested interest in these projects being successful. Parties might be working with each other on another phase of the same project or on another project in a different location. So I think just at a high level, where we all sit here talking about what are the DR mechanisms across the industry, on a practical level, a lot of my clients at least actually don't want to know about what their all singing, all dancing arbitration clause says, or their, England and Wales court jurisdiction clause says. What they actually want to know about is, how do we resolve this now? How can we settle this now? How can we actually help the contractor resolve this issue so that they'll keep performing the contracts and this is going to be a great success? I don't know, Marianne, if your experience is
completely agree, and actually, the kind of help that we look for is not someone coming in and saying, right, we're going to get on with the arbitration now. It's kind of, well, what cunning strategies can you come up with to put pressure on the counterparties to come and talk to us and do a deal? And this.
Do you think
Now
that's
getting
going to
to
be tested sort of going forward with higher interest rates and greater?
Absolutely.
You were talking about pushing everything down the supply chain and.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's always been tricky and it continues to be tricky, and, we are hoping that things will start to get better in terms of, balance of risk and reward and so on. But we are, exactly to your point, where we are it's a small market, so we're almost trying to pick clients from the start now. We're trying to do business with people that we know we can work with, so we're almost avoiding disputes right from before we even sign the contract.
I want to just jump on that point that Marianne said, which is about the techniques and the factors used that you bring into settlements discussions to get everything back working and avoid the dispute. What are those factors that you're specifically thinking about?
Well, a kind of weird example, I guess, is I was talking before about the debt finance nature of our projects. So you often have a lender lurking about in the background, and quite often we enter into direct agreements with the lender, which is supposed to be there to say that, to give the lender rights. So basically, if somebody drops out of the project, the lender can step in or can make somebody else step in. So you wouldn't think that would necessarily help us. But if we're in a situation where we're just, communication breakdown with the client, we're not getting anywhere with the client, actually having that direct contractual nexus with the lender, to be able to serve a lender, notice on the lender saying, we think that the employer's in breach, the lenders start going, oh, crumbs, we don't like the look of this, and they start to kind of potentially come in and basically bang heads together and get, so it's not necessarily a normal way that we would pursue our rights. We can't pursue our rights against the lender. We don't have any rights against them, but we can bring them into the frame. That's quite left field, but it's that sort of thing. What can we do? Or bringing in experts on a particular topic. Who can support us? Often we were talking about all the technical issues that arise. If someone can bring a real interesting angle on why this issue has arisen, we do get a fantastic expert that we can point to, that everybody goes, oh my goodness, we don't want to stand up against that person in court. And perhaps the nationality matters. We have a lot of work in Norway. Some of these jurisdictions, it's the same in the UK. We're all like this, aren't we? We all know our own jurisdictions. If you can produce perhaps an expert who's incredibly well known in Norway, and they're on your side, then suddenly the case starts to resolve itself because nobody wants to be against that person. It's those kind of ideas that, I think we all probably do as litigation lawyers anyway, but that's what you want to see early on, rather than, right guys, we can make loads of money out of an arbitration, so let's gear up the team of 20 and off we go, kind of thing.
Certainly calling for the bond, absolutely. As night follows day, you'll call for the bond. But the idea of actually just leapfrogging that contractual mechanism to go straight to the headmaster's office and sneak, effectively, your pupil's not doing a great job of managing this dispute and our ships are going to be over there, come what may, it's fantastic leverage of pressure to put. It is a very powerful leverage mechanism. Does that arise outside the wind? It's the same
on FIDIC contracts, World Bank funded projects. You'll often have visits from the World Bank and issuing reports, and they'll comment. They'll break the sites never look so tidy.
Yes. Right. Oh, that's very interesting that one is actually seeing that happening. When you have these disputes, when you actually do have a breakdown, and we've mentioned about arbitrations being used, and we've mentioned about negotiations and the DR clause and very rarely DBs. What would be the best way when you've got more than one party, would you say? Anybody can pick this up. For a multi-party dispute where you don't necessarily have, you don't have a chain contract, you don't have multi-parties in any one contract, you've got no one arbitration provision that applies to them all. So what is it that you do in that situation?
Well, I think that's going to be a trend now, isn't it, with EPCM contracting becoming more common.
Certainly moving into that. If we had the Arbitration Act going on the books, then we'd have a lot more scope for having other mechanisms that can pass via arbitration. But can you talk a bit about the EPCM contracting and its likely impact, Ed?
Well, obviously that's going to mean that the employer, rather than having a single point of responsibility for an EPC contractor on a project like an offshore wind, will instead have numerous contract packages and maybe a construction and project manager responsible for coordinating all those packages. So it's going to need joinder provisions in all those contract packages to bring them all into one single set of proceedings, because otherwise it's going to run the risk of getting inconsistent decisions between different tribunals,
Yes.
as well as it just taking a long time to resolve any disputes.
And that is the fundamental issue in terms of arbitration. It has got a lot going for it for this sector, but there's still a lot of work to go. It is characterised, this sector, by the multi-party, the multi-contract, the multi-jurisdiction in some instances that we've touched on. We are seeing developments in that. We are seeing, as you say, the Law Commission's looking at in terms of the joinder provisions moving forward. We've got the, some of the arbitral bodies, some of their rules now have that. We've got some standard drafting. But of course, all of that relies on the contracts being back-to-back, or certainly the arbitration agreements being back-to-back. And again, the fractured nature of this industry means that that is just not always the case. I don't know what the solution is to in terms of that. I'm not sure that there is a best form of DR to be able to pull all of these together. It might again come back to actually if we had a more accepted form of industry standard form contract with industry drafting, that we might see a little bit more consistency and an ability to be able to pull in third parties a bit easier.
Yeah.
Well, I mean sorry, did you?
Go on.
I was just going to say, if we're moving on now to looking at the future, standing back and looking at it now from just what people have been saying, it sounds like the very people who could make that happen is the banks and the lenders, who will only allow their contract money to be operated via, or their available money for these projects, to be operated via certain contracts, which have already had this thrashed out. So it may be not every contract you wish to have joinder provisions, but if you do know which parties are going to be involved and are most likely to be involved in disputes because of your past experience, you might request that layer of contracting to have the joinder provisions in already. You might specifically want to have an engineer allocated perhaps for technical disputes only and demarcate what those technical disputes would be. Do you think that kind of a more, perhaps, I'm thinking front-loaded contract formation, but it's more about front-loading the drafting of the contract, i.e. it goes up the chain rather than, they've got the control, it's their money, and ultimately they're the ones who are interested in the project coming online at the right time. Do you see that, Victoria, as part of the future?
I'm following. I don't know. I've got issues. I'm thinking in my head while I'm listening. Possible procurement issues. I'm not sure how that would work out. I know the arbitral institution, SIAC, has very good joinder rules, for example. There is the ability for joinder out there already.
Yeah.
Going forwards, I don't know how to improve that.
And you obviously would probably want a limit on it, not to have the entire supply chain in
I was just going to say, I think that's my main concern. So I did a bunch of arbitrations over the construction of Australia's largest LNG project. So the project was about 54 billion all up, and the cost increase was 180%. In the end, and that was done on an EPCM contracting structure. So our client was one of the owners of that project. They had an EPCM who failed utterly to perform their role, and that's putting it politely. And then they had however many, I think it was about 48 different, what they called implementation contractors doing the work. And we ended up with a series of arbitrations against different different implementation contractors, which were generally your bog standard delay, disruption, give me some more money, here's some variations, claims. But their packages were very different, right? So you had your earthworks contractor, you had your tanks contractor, you had your accommodation provider, etc. They didn't care about each other's claims. They weren't really interlinked in terms of their contractual relationship with each other and with the client. So in that circumstance, I don't think it would have really helped to have had the joinder or consolidation provision. And then when you looked at the EPCM contractor, their obligations weren't necessarily linked to their performance of something on the critical path or whatever. Their obligations were all linked to managing this project, to managing the programs, to managing the cost, to approving things on time, etc. So the claim that was ultimately brought against them was very different to anything that had been brought against or by the implementation contractors. So in that scenario, I think it would have been a waste of time and cost to actually bring those together. But what would probably have been helpful earlier on in the project is a sit down around the table amongst the EPCM contractor, the implementation contractor that was behind for whatever reason, and some form of negotiation or mediation around those issues, because I think that would have helped to not only prevent the disputes that resulted down the track, but also some of the practical steps that our client had taken to try and fix all of these issues would never have been necessary if people early on would have actually sat around a table and talked about things. And I think that's true on a lot of projects. Just one last point, going back to my point about, what was I talking about before with you? I now can't remember. My point was about early dispute resolution, I think. No, it was about early dispute resolution and trying to settle things early. Just linked to that, we've also seen an increase in parties bringing in either their claims consultants or proper independent expert arbitration standard folks a lot earlier on, so that owners and contractors, I think, are in a better position to have an informed discussion around a table, which I think is also super helpful. So in terms of the future and ways to resolve these web of disputes, I'm very much in favour of attempting to negotiate your way through them.
It's quite interesting because, I mean, in terms of a formal process, it looks like it's arbitration before all the usual reasons for any infrastructure construction project. But actually for ADR, that idea of around the table, not really a mediation, not an expert determination, but just early, and not a dispute board, heaven forbid, but just, you know, avoiding all of those rather more formal techniques and just going back to the old style, shall we just talk, round table meeting. I can see
Is that not what a standing dispute board does, though?
It's certainly, well, exactly, that's what I find interesting, in the sense that mostly that as a required provision in the ADR is being struck out, but from what people are describing, that's what it offers.
It's you know, the weathered eye, as Sir Robert Aikenhead says. It's there on site. He's there, or she, to ask questions, to sort out problems, nip them in the bud.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly from this discussion, that sounds like that should ought to be part of the future. Jess, is there anything else about the future in renewables that you were wanting to raise? I was thinking specifically about the current state of the economy, the political issues that we're facing as a world, and how that is likely to play out in this particular sector.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a fascinating question. I think we can, when we're looking at the future of ADR in the renewables sector, we can easily summarise that with the nice, neat phrase, more, more, more. Don't worry, I'm not going to launch into song. That really is just a phrase. So what do we mean by more, more, more? Well, if we look at the immediate future, what we're already seeing is considerable volatility in the domestic and international energy markets, driven very much by the war in Ukraine, the Russian sanctions. Looking immediate future, but also perhaps mid and longer term, we are going to need to see greater commitment towards net zero, to the energy transition. And I think all of those factors and some of the others that have been talked about today on this panel and more widely, they are going to mean that we're going to see exponential growth in the renewables sector. So that is my first more. We're going to see more renewables. This next bit is then going to sound far too fatalistic, but I think history shows it's probably accurate. As the industry, as the sector grows, we're going to see more disputes. Whether that is a proportional increase in disputes, that's going to remain to be seen. So there we go, my second more then, we're going to see more renewable disputes. So that leads nicely onto the third and final more. That means, we've already touched on today and more widely that ADR has been, it's a long-standing feature in relation to renewables for some of the good reasons that we've touched on. Sometimes for some of these projects, court is not going to be the way for the parties to really realise their objectives. I do think it's really interesting, again, picking up on some of the comments that were made earlier around mandatory ADR. We've heard today already from Marion about the Churchill and Merthyr Tydfil case. Many in the room will be familiar with it, but in that case, the court found that, yes, of course, we're entitled and empowered to direct that the parties engage in non-court-based dispute resolution. That case has, of course, led to the introduction of compulsory mediation in the small claims. Churchill, it's not a renewables case, it's not an energy case, and as I say, it's currently, the impact is largely restricted to the small claims. But we've got the Civil Procedure Rules Committee, that's the body that's responsible for implementing and amending the CPR. There's a consultation that they're running at the moment, the committee's running, and they're currently inviting views on exactly whether we should have compulsory use of ADR into the CPR. So we're seeing a clear sort of direction of travel, and it's very much away from the court doors, and it's very much towards ADR. So I don't know if Luke Weigass is still in the room, but I think probably I'm not in his camp in terms of whether mediation and ADR is dead. And we've also touched on today, actually, just the very nature of some of these renewable projects. They provide kindling for disputes to sort of ignite. We've touched on this sort of throughout today and in this panel. We've touched on things like the capital costs, the high capex, the fact that they're frequently involving new, innovative, sometimes unproven technologies. Many of these projects have incredibly low tolerance for delays. They're revenue generating. That's how the model works. As soon as revenue is interrupted, the finances start to look a bit shaky. So against all of those sort of backdrop, I don't think it's inconceivable that we would start to see a move, very much a firm shove towards seriously thinking about looking at ADR in this sector a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, certainly that decision, the Japanese knotweed decision, as I've logged it in my head, it's the decision is actually full of the caveats that you would expect from a high-level appellate decision. You know, it's actually you have to have the safeguards, you have to have the approach to court, and so on. And in fact, I think in that case, it never actually forced the mediation
because they'd already past that point.
They'd already resolved it. But I think what's interesting about what you were just saying about the future and combining it with the politics and the political change that we're about to have next month, with a majority party coming in that is already saying that one of its manifesto things will be to have a nationalised renewable energy source, which will probably rewrite this area. If you're going to have the government actually owning a new company, which should be revenue driven, but not perhaps in the same way that a private company would be revenue driven, that it may well be that we do have a rewriting of how these contracts are going to be done. I mean, particularly when you mentioned about the impact on procurement. And, as soon as the government steps up and starts getting involved in these contracts, then all the procurement legislation will swing into place. And it will have to be done according to what's already been set out. That aspect of ADR, I don't know if anybody in the room is actually involved in these kind of procurement issues and whether they've impacted already when you're looking at the use of licenses, the issue of licenses to be able to start your process, the feeding of into the grid and the control and the payments out. I mean, for example, the fines that happened because certain companies overcharged for when they shut down and weren't supplying in periods of oversupply. There seems to me to be a likelihood in the future that there will be more government overlay to this industry. Have you noticed that is coming this way, or has anybody mentioned it, particularly the Law Commission?
I think it'll be an interesting change. Actually, renewables has been a sector that was actually, it's been a little bit out on its own. It has been a sort of developers, contractors who've been sort of leading the way themselves.
Yeah.
It will be quite a considerable change if we are seeing more of a sort of public stake in these things.
Did you have something you wanted to say?
No, it's a very interesting point, and you know, there's going to need to be huge investment. I think I was reading the other day about 60 billion investment in National Grid to get that modernised, and you know, who knows quite how a Labour government would use this.
Yes, I mean, one of the areas that you talked about was the problem with grid connections, and that the hapless contractor who takes on the project to put the photovoltaic units up then has to join up to a grid which is not fit for purpose. And is expected to just deal with that, even without a variation to the contract. I mean, that strikes me as a not sustainable business plan.
It's worse than that. You can have suddenly the expectation that you're doing very expensive reinforcement works, and depending on the size of the project, those reinforcement works, we're talking millions.
Yes.
So it soon makes the finances look, again, a little bit worrisome.
Indeed.
You also have the overlay of National Grid in those circumstances. So I've already started seeing disputes coming through where wind farms in particular have connected to the grid, something has gone wrong during commissioning, or that National Grid has seen something on the grid as a result of said wind farm being connected, has taken certain action that owner of wind farm disagrees with. Action has led to wind farm coming off the grid for X number of days equals loss of revenue, equals, well, how do you actually deal with this circumstance because there's nothing in the grid code to tell you, etc., etc. So we're already seeing bubbles of that overlay happening.
Yeah. Well, the more disputes, I suppose, particularly for everybody who's attending this conference, one way or another, is probably what we're all not necessarily hoping for, but we will certainly be engaged in those kind of disputes.
Yeah. Brian McMullen's my name. I'm a lawyer based in Ireland. I'm on the ADR committee of the Law Society, Council of the Law Society of Ireland, and the litigation committee of the Law Society of Ireland. I'm also an arbitrator and mediator, and most importantly, a solicitor advising on significant infrastructural projects. I think this has been touched upon by one of the speakers. Generally, the employer doesn't care in terms of the dispute method of dispute resolution. And we as lawyers tend to overcomplicate, in my view, the various different methods that are available. And I think we're not as imaginative as we should be. I mean, the most effective method of dispute resolution is the lawyer-to-lawyer negotiation, whether that's structured on the basis similar to mediation. But in terms of mediation, the magic that occurs in terms of mediation when you have everybody together and you have the experts together, you can get to a situation where perhaps there is 80% of the agreement there, and sometimes it's said, well, what is the answer here? Where do we go? Do we go back to the commercial court or whatever? But there are other imaginative ways of dealing with things in terms of perhaps dealing with that 30% that hasn't been agreed by way of some form of expert determination. But sometimes, as lawyers, we're not as imaginative as we should be, and perhaps we're more fixated with the options rather than looking more creatively in terms of what can be done.
Anybody wish to address that? I think from what Mary-Anne was saying, certainly the lawyers in the companies are extremely creative in the way in which they will go about achieving a resolution, from reaching outside the contract to see if there is a way of cracking a particular nut that's nobody's getting past. Does anybody have experience of actual lawyer-to-lawyer discussions resolving a dispute finally?
There seems to be more, a number of these parties are incredibly sophisticated and actually they unlock it. The lawyers will take it so far.
Yeah.
The parties then get in the room. I don't know if you've had similar experience.
The first layer, commercial discussion. Yeah. Is that what you were going to say, Ed?
Well, yes, because you're going to need, a lot of parties, supply chain in the room, and in my experience, there's more commercial discussions.
There's usually that first layer where a representative at commercial level, director, stroke officer, is to discuss the dispute, and that after that point. Does that quite often resolve it?
Not in the type of disputes I get involved in. But one point I would say on that, and it ties into the point the gentleman was making here, is that sometimes I think parties agree their DR clause, in whatever year we're now in, 2024, something happens in 2027 and they say, okay, what does the contract say? And they try to kind of go through the stages. And it actually doesn't have to be that way, because even though you've agreed that clause, when a dispute comes up, it's always open to the parties to sit down and agree to do something that might be better suited to their circumstances. And I include in that keeping settlement under review at various different stages of the DR process, even right through to the night before a hearing. And I think sometimes parties can lose sight of that. Yeah. So it's part of our job, I think, to keep reminding them and prompting them as to when are the right points to engage in a discussion again.
Yeah.